slide right here. Wendy, Henry, and I have been working together actually for a long time. We have taught many, many classes together here in the Chicagoland area. It's been a pleasure all these years working with Wendy. A great person. She is a presenter at many conferences. She's now an author also of this book called Storage Considerations for Microsoft SharePoint. She's a MCT, MCTS, MCITP, and one of the principal contributors to SharePointVideos.com. So if you've been to SharePointVideos.com, chances are pretty high that you've seen lots of videos from her. You can also find some videos from her on YouTube as well. So Wendy has done a lot of education basically on SharePoint, but not just SharePoint. She has done other stuff as well. So with that, Wendy, are you there?
I am.
Great. So Wendy's going to be talking about smart storage considerations for SharePoint. Basically how, well, we of course amass a lot of data in SharePoint. Where do you put that data? How do you scale it better? There's got to be some good guidelines and all that we all need for SharePoint. So Wendy is here to discuss that and a whole lot more. All right, Wendy, take it away.
Thanks, Asif. Everyone hopefully is interested today in learning about how to pick the right storage platform for your SharePoint implementation and also how to grow that platform. One of the biggest concerns most SharePoint implementers have is once you put SharePoint out there to the end users and they like it and it's popular, then how do you go about actually scaling this product? So for the next hour, we're going to talk about smart storage solutions for Microsoft SharePoint Server. And hopefully, I have a shared virtual machine in front of you. If you cannot see the virtual machine, please do let Asif or myself know. It should be focused on Microsoft Office SharePoint Server Central Administration, which most SharePoint admins in the audience will be well familiar with. This is SharePoint's formal focused administration tool for their product. And what we're going to do today is kind of walk around in this virtual machine, take a look at some of the reasons why you need to consider what your storage facility is for SharePoint and how to go about choosing the right platform. And hopefully we're not having any technical difficulties.
So, hey, Wendy, I got a question for you before we start here.
Okay.
You know, Microsoft SharePoint, of course, is an application, just a web application. So what makes SharePoint different from any other application when it comes to storage?
Well, it's a good thing you pointed that out. SharePoint, yes, it is a web application, but it is quite different in the way that it behaves. And most of this has to do with the fact that SharePoint needs the help of a couple of different players when it comes to implementing SharePoint. It's not just about installing the SharePoint product itself. SharePoint uses Microsoft SQL Server as its storage facility. So if you don't have SQL Server on the box, when you go to lay down Windows SharePoint Services or you take the MOS CD and you install the product, it will put a version of SQL Server onto the box. This is SQL Server Management Studio, and looking at it very quickly, under the databases in the Object Explorer, you can see several databases that have the word SharePoint in their name, and the WSS acronym for Windows SharePoint Services in the name of the content databases. So it stores everything in SQL Server, and then it delivers the content stored there via Microsoft Web Server Platform, Internet Information Services. So here we have Internet Information Services Management Console. Underneath the websites node, you can see that there are some websites in here that have SharePoint in their name. And given the fact that SharePoint uses these other two supporting applications, when you start thinking about storage platform for SharePoint, you need to consider these dependency products as well. What is the best way to lay out your website files? What is the best way to lay out your SQL Server databases? Now, when it comes to IIS and SQL management in a large enterprise, it's not unusual to find a segregated IT management style. And what I mean by that is you've got one team of webmasters out there, and they're responsible for being this IIS management console and deciding where to place their website files. Then you've got a whole separate team of DBAs that work in IT, and they're responsible for being here in SQL Server Management Studio, deciding where to store all of these databases. And then lastly, you would have the actual SharePoint admins who tend to spend their day here in Central Administration website, moving around in operations and application management and taking care of the SharePoint product. So in a segregated IT department, you have to get all three of those folks together and sit down and decide what's the best way to store things. Now, it seems like extra work because you're thinking, I'm the SharePoint admin, I should be able to just make a storage decision. But the truth is these three products actually use the disk hardware very differently. If we take a look starting out with the IIS product, this is the web server product, and if you look at any of these SharePoint databases, you can see that these SharePoint websites are actually split out into multiple web applications. Now, what is the correlation between IIS and SharePoint? Well, if we take a look at SharePoint Central Admin very quickly and head into application management, you guys are probably aware that the logical architecture of SharePoint starts out at the web app level. You create yourself a web application, and it's going to be used to store one or more site collections. If we look at this web application list, I see that I have a SharePoint-80 web application in SharePoint. If I look over at IIS management, sure enough, there's a website called SharePoint-80. So each web application that you create logically in SharePoint is going to generate one of these IIS websites. Now, the website is designed to house several different web applications. It's kind of confusing a little bit that the IIS product uses the term web application very much so like SharePoint uses the term. A web application within a site in IIS is any programmable code that lives in one of the virtual directories of the IIS website. And you can go into that directory and execute that code, and it does something. So when you create a SharePoint web app, it actually generates an IIS website. Within that IIS website, that site has been extended to house and execute a bunch of SharePoint applications. But where do those applications actually live? If we take a look at this, it's actually setting files down on the file system. Now, this is going to be an NTFS formatted file system. It's a little more efficient than FAT. It's more secure than FAT. But where you place all of these files is going to have impact on the performance of IIS regarding your SharePoint site. So you'd want to make sure that these SharePoint sites and IIS are placing their files onto a nice, robust NTFS formatted file system on some pretty fast disk hardware. But that's just the actual delivery mechanism. If we take a look at the storage mechanism, each of these web applications is configured to use a particular content database over in SQL Server. Here I am back in Central Administration. I'm going to head into content databases just to get a look around. And here we see that there's a database called WSS Content for the web application that uses URL HTTP server. Now you're thinking to yourself, well, hold on, I don't remember there being a web app named HTTP server. You are looking at one of the challenges of the Central Administration tool. If we go back and look at the list of web applications, that SharePoint-80 web app has a URL of HTTP server. And different ASPX pages here in the Central Admin tool will resolve either the name of the web app and display it to you or the URL of the web app and display it to you. So you kind of have to know both of these pieces of information to find your way around. When we look back at content databases, it's using the URL of the web app and showing me the name of the content database over in SQL Server that houses the content for that web application. So what exactly is the correlation here? Well, each web application you generate in SharePoint is going to automatically, by default, create a WSS content database. Now, WSS underscore content is just the default name of the database. You have the opportunity to custom name it when you place it into this location. And for each new web app you generate, and you allow it to generate a new content database, it keeps using that WSS underscore content default name, just simply starts adding with numbers onto the end. So each of these content databases are housing all of the document library items and the list items and the pictures that you're putting into the SharePoint site in the site collections that reside within that web app. Now there's other databases here in Management Studio as well. You've got some configuration databases. You've got shared service provider databases if you employ a MOS SSP. But let's just stick with the content and take a look at how confusing this can be in a segregated IT department for a DBA who's not a SharePoint admin to understand which of these databases goes with which web app. For that reason, you might want to custom name these databases. But how exactly does SQL Server store its data? IIS was real easy. You looked at the properties of the site. It told you exactly which folder in Windows Explorer you could expect to find website files in. That was great. But when it comes to SQL Server, this product is much more complex in how it stores things. If we take a look very quickly, and I'm just going to pull a drawing up from a chapter. I apologize for the extra text. But hopefully now you are looking at a Word document, and within that document I've got a diagram of how SQL Server database data files are laid down on the hard drive. SQL Server actually allocates a footprint for every database based on that database's size property. And that footprint is divided into 64 kilobyte extents that are broken up into 8 kilobyte pages apiece. So when you actually start storing data into the database as a row in a table, it takes up a little bit of header room in the page, and then it stores all the row data in there. So when SQL Server is getting ready to house a SharePoint database, and the SharePoint Central admin goes in and creates the new database for you, it makes the database according to whatever the system database model is set up to be. All new databases inherit some things from model unless otherwise specified. If we look at the properties of this WSS content database, go into its files page of its properties, we can start seeing how the database laid down on the hard drive. It has a data file, and it has a transaction log file. All databases have to have at least one key log. And if we scroll over to the path, sure enough, boom, it's using the default directory path. Now the thing about this content database is over time, as your users are putting more and more items into SharePoint, this thing's going to start growing. And if we run out of room in that path that you're looking at here, we're going to not be able to accept any new data into SharePoint. So in addition to thinking about IIS and having a really big disk subset for the NTFS files that will hold your website, you also have to start thinking about your SQL Server MDF database data files. Where are you going to put them? So it's not just a matter of thinking about SharePoint. You have to think about SharePoint, IIS, and SQL Server when you're getting ready to plan your storage for SharePoint.
This is really good stuff, Wendy. Thanks a lot. Another question that comes to mind, actually, if you don't mind. Both of us, of course, have been teaching for a long time, especially SharePoint, and we get to see so many different users using it so many different ways in a very, very creative ways. And once users get a feel for SharePoint, in the corporate environment, they really like it. There's so much stuff you can do with it. But how can you make sure that SharePoint itself, which of course stores everything in the databases, how do you make sure that SharePoint has room to grow on that storage?
Excellent point. It's actually documented by Microsoft that there's a certain percentage of SharePoint deployments that fail, not because the product fails to meet expectations, but because over time, with inefficient or insufficient storage underneath SharePoint, users start becoming disappointed with not only the performance of the product, but also with their ability to keep adding new content into the site. So you really have to plan for the long term when you start looking at your storage solution. You can't just buy a big enough single disk for now and place it into a server, because in 3 months or 6 months, you're going to find out that that disk is sitting at 99% full, and you're going to be running out to buy more hardware. Now there's a couple of things you can do to make sure that SharePoint is using your disk subset as efficiently as possible. and it's one of my personal mantras. It's a soapbox that I get on all the time. It's called single instance storage. One of the things that happens in SharePoint is users tend to treat their SharePoint document libraries and their lists very much like they treat Windows Explorer. If you've ever looked at a user's home folder, you've probably noticed that they have a bevy of folders. And if you were to look around, you'd find that they have the same file stored many, many times. They keep losing it in their directory substructure, so they keep putting more copies in. If you don't train your users on single instance storage, you're going to have them following those same behavior patterns here in SharePoint. And here's what I mean by that. I'm looking at a fictitious Moss portal here. And I'm just going to head over to the Document Center really quickly so that I can play with a document library. Not that there's anything really big deal about this. It's just a sample environment. But one of the things that happens is users will tend to upload a document, say like this upload demo. And it's here in the Documents document library on the Document Center. And then one of their compatriots that uses another site that has its own document library in it as well. If we head over to Sites directory, we take a look at any of the sites that are listed in this directory. Let me create a site very quickly. We'll just use a team template. They'll have a compatriot that works in a completely different site say, hey, I need a copy of that upload demo document. Well, there's two ways that their compatriot here in the test site could be able to interface with that upload demo. They could upload it again here at their shared documents document library. But what you end up with is two copies of the document in SharePoint. An easier way to do this would be to provide these folks with a link that goes back to the Document Center document library, and maybe even a link directly to that document. Because if you look at any item in any list, I'm picking on document libraries here, but this could be a picture library, it could be an announcements list, it could be a task list, doesn't matter. Every item in every list in SharePoint has a URL directly to it. It's a hyperlink. So if I were to copy the shortcut of that hyperlink and then place that link on that team site, I would be bringing them to this original document. Now, a lot of people will say, well, what if I want to work with a document, I want to have a lot of people on it, but I don't want it to show up here because it's not ready. Anytime you want, you can hover over a document and generate yourself a second copy of this in what's called the document workspace. So document workspaces in Moss and WSS do violate single instance storage because they take a copy of the document down to a separate site. But the beauty there is as you're making changes to that work in progress document, you have the opportunity to publish those changes here up to the library. So single instance storage training within SharePoint by your SharePoint users can help make sure that you have SharePoint using the disks as efficiently as possible. Another thing you can take a look at doing is actually going up to your DBAs and asking them to take a look at the layout of the content databases. Because here in SQL Server, to have only a single data file for this content database and to place it into a single folder location isn't exactly the optimal way to handle what SQL Server calls a VLD, or very large database. You may consider adding secondary files to the database. But here's the challenge with secondary files. This content database was created by SharePoint when the SharePoint admin went into central administration and created a new web application. And at no point was that person given the opportunity to make changes to the way that this database would get created. SharePoint just went over to SQL Server and said, build it this way. And there was nothing in the interface that gave the human a chance to customize the way the database would be built. Because the database was built and populated with tables the minute it was created over there in central admin, all of your content tables live in this MDF data file up here. And any of you in the audience who are SQL Server DBAs, you know that when you've got stuff already in the MDF, it's really difficult to move those tables out to a secondary data file after the fact. But here we go, file groups. In SQL Server, you have the opportunity to group those MDF and NDF data files of your database up into these file group names. And if you notice that little default checkbox right there, whichever file group is marked default, that's the file group that all new tables and views and things will get created into. But we actually populated this content database with its table and view object the very day we created it. So even if your DBA says, well, I'll just use file groups, and I'll mark a new file group full of a bunch of secondary files as the default file group, and all new content will pop into there. No, actually it won't. You are going to have to move tables around in your secondary files, and you're going to have to do this manually. Now, let me tell you guys, what I'm about to say to you is not a Microsoft best practice. Microsoft does not endorse directly managing your SharePoint databases here in SQL Server Management Studio. But if you had a very experienced DBA and they wanted to take a tack at doing this over in a sandbox or a virtual lab environment first to make sure it would work, there is a way to move tables and views out to newly generated secondary files. And you could actually spread the SQL Server content database across multiple data files. And here's the beauty of the data file. First, I'll give it a name. And this is just a logical name that it's going to be represented as in the GUI so that I can see it. So I'll call it data file 2. And then I'll come over to its path. Look at this. You can put it somewhere else. And you may want to do this. It gives you the chance to stretch that WSS content database across multiple physical hard drives, each of which may even be a RAID set of multiple disks. So you can use some tips and tricks over in the other supporting products, like IIS and like SQL Server, to try to help maximize the disk utilization being performed by SharePoint.
So hey, Wendy, sorry to interject here, but another thing that comes to mind here, if somebody's looking right now to, to purchase some storage, and what do you think? What is your suggestion? What kind of hardware platforms should they be looking at?
Excellent question. There's so many choices out there today. You go server shopping, HP, Dell, whoever your platform provider is, and there's so many different ways you can configure a machine. And obviously when you buy hardware, usually you're buying it with some purpose in mind. So if you're sitting down thinking, okay, I want to buy a new server that I'm going to use for Windows SharePoint Services, one of the first things that you need to start thinking about before you even pick up the phone to call your hardware manufacturer is what type of layout you're planning for SharePoint. Now, one of the things that's beautiful about the SharePoint software is that it has the ability to be scaled out. And I'm going to stop sharing my virtual machine really quickly and go ahead and show you guys yet another document really quick. Okay? We know that a single web application, logically in SharePoint, can house one or more site selections. And this is really the logical layout. Yeah, in this picture I point to a little WSS content database over there. So really the crux of this drawing is the fact that you can have more than one site selection populated with many, many sites in the web app. And this is really what everybody seems to think about when they start thinking about SharePoint and design. Okay, I'm going to need one site for my human resources and one site for my accounting. And that's great. That's classifying your data and developing a taxonomy of where you will place certain data based on its purpose or based on its ownership. But this is really only the logical stuff. And when it comes to scaling this kind of thing out, what you may find is if you bought one piece of hardware and you put SQL Server and IIS Server and SharePoint Services on that one box, and you had what Microsoft calls a single server environment, that might serve your users well, but only for a few months. And eventually your users would call you up and say, I'm sitting here, and I'm sorry for scrolling through this in front of you, but I've got to find another drawing in here. you know, I'm sitting here and it's great and all, but it seems to be a little slow. Over time, I've gotten into the single SharePoint server with everything on the box, and as more people have jumped on, performance has gone crazy. So you start looking at scaling the SharePoint product out. And SharePoint scales into what's called a SharePoint Farm. Microsoft has definite opinions about what a small versus a medium versus a large farm is. Here we are looking at a small farm. And with a small farm, you'd run back to your hardware manufacturer and you'd buy a second box. And you'd move the SQL Server product with all those SharePoint databases in it out to the second box. So now your user is interfacing with a box that has IIS and SharePoint on it, and that box goes back to the SQL Server behind it every time it needs to grab content. Now this may work for you if you support less than 1,500 users, if your data tends to be rather static, it doesn't change every minute of the day, and if you're a small company with a limited budget. But in a large enterprise, even after doing this, a couple of months later, the users are calling the help desk again going, things are too slow. So you start looking at scaling it out yet even a little bit further. Now, one of the terms that Microsoft uses in their vocabulary is the machine the users hit that has IIS on it. It's called the Web Front-End SharePoint Server. So you may decide to scale the WFE and just have more than one WFE, but still have one SQL Server behind them. That would be considered a small to medium farm. Or you might decide to, in addition to splitting off the SQL Server product, start splitting off some of the actual SharePoint services. So here you start moving the SharePoint Index out. Now the reason I wanted to show you these drawings, and I'm done with that, is because it depends on what your farm is going to be as to whether or not you need to buy different types of storage platforms. If we take a look at SQL Server in particular, anybody would tell you the best practice for a SQL Server is to go out and at least buy disks that have been coupled up together in a RAID configuration. Well, RAID, as all of you probably know, is really nothing more than the ability to have different, sorry, I got the wrong drawing there. Give me just a second. There we go. All right, hopefully you're looking at a RAID drawing. And this is really the art, nothing more than grabbing multiple physical disks and then creating some type of software control against them that makes it look like they're a single entity to the Windows Server OS and therefore to the SQL Server product. Now, the Windows Server operating system has its own software RAID capabilities right there in the OS, but I wouldn't recommend them for SharePoint, and here's why. You're at the vulnerability of the Windows operating system itself, and should it become corrupt or should it go down, you've just lost all of your hard drive. I would strongly recommend looking instead at hardware RAID. Now, there's different levels of RAID. This is just a Stripe example where you have the C drive consisting of 10 gigabyte chunks off of more than one disk. In fact, it's 3 disks. You have the D drive, similarly, chunking off 10 gig off of each physical hard drive, and you get that 300 gig stripe. And then you don't have to make the E drive just as big. You could use RAID 1 mirroring, which grabs equal spaces from 2 but no more disks and redundantly stores the data twice. So I would definitely start out in any SharePoint farm, whether it was going to be a small single server farm or whether it was going to be a small farm with one WFE split off from the SQL Server, or whether it was going to be a really large enterprise farm with 10 WFEs, one SharePoint Index server, 2 SharePoint app servers, and a big SQL Server behind it. Regardless, every single one of those boxes should have RAID capability on their hard drive set. Now, there's different levels of RAID, and I'm not going to go through this table, but suffice it to say that you want to buy the one that is most efficient for the purpose of the data. When it comes to the content databases and things like that, they suffer a lot of read and write performance. So I wouldn't necessarily go with a RAID 1 mirror. I'd probably look more towards a Stripe set with parity like RAID 5 or RAID 10 or RAID 0+1. When it comes to SQL Server, Microsoft has some best practice opinions, let me put that in, some opinions, about which RAID is best for your database data file and your database transaction log file. Microsoft would tell you put your database data files on a RAID 5 stripe set with parity, or a RAID 10 or a RAID 0+1. And then they would tell you to put your LDF transaction log file for that database on a RAID 1 mirror set. And the point they're making there is the log file gets read more than it gets written to, and having that RAID 1 mirror duplicate set of the T-log allows you to get to the T-log in the event of failure. So I would definitely be looking at RAID stuff. So again, going back to whether you're doing a small farm or a large farm, it's going to have a lot to do with where these disks live. In a single server SharePoint farm, where SQL and IIS and SharePoint are all on the same box, you're probably going to use local disks, hard drives that are right there in that machine. But when you start scaling out, when you separate SQL Server off of the SharePoint box, make it its own box in a small SharePoint farm, SQL Server becomes your main concern of storage on that box, and you're not likely going to be using local disks inside that box anymore. You're probably going to start looking instead at a network access storage solution like a NAS drive vault that sits in your rack very near your servers and has a bunch of hard drives in the front of it. Or you could potentially look at clustering the SQL Server product and set up your cluster to use some honkin' huge SAN behind it. The SAN is going to allow the front cluster nodes to connect directly to it. It's going to be probably pretty large. Most folks who invest in a storage area network SAN device tend to pay for really, really big hard drives, maybe even up to the terabyte size. So it depends on what your logical SharePoint farm layout is going to look like as to which of the storage platforms you're really going to be interested in. Now, if you take a look at SAN, if you decide, okay, I'm going at least with a medium farm, I know I'm going to be separating that SQL Server off of my SharePoint box, turning the SharePoint box into nothing more than a web front-end SharePoint server, and having the SQL Server product be on a separate box behind it. And for my own comfort, I want to know that if one node fails, the other node picks up the work so that SharePoint can always get to its SQL Server databases. I'm going to cluster the SQL Server. So I know I'm going to be buying a SAN for that SQL Server part of my SharePoint farm. You have a lot of choices when it comes to SAN. There's the old traditional tried and true SAN solution that used to be called Fiber Channel, and there's still a lot of them out there. And I'm not knocking Fiber Channel. It's great. But relatively new to the market, and I say relatively new because this has been around actually for about 4 years, but it came into popularity about 2 years ago, is to use what's called an iSCSI SAN. With an iSCSI SAN, and hopefully you are looking at a drawing of an initiator and a target, you have the server itself. This is going to be your front-end node, if you will, in your SQL cluster. And it has an OS on it. It has an NTFS file system on its local disk. It has local storage, and that's great. But I don't want to put all of my SQL databases there. I actually want to put my SQL databases over on the right on the target. The target is my SAN platters that are in a SAN storage device that I bought from somebody like, I don't know, HP or EM or somebody like that. The beauty of iSCSI is it leans on the SCSI driver layer. This is the protocol that spins that hard drive platter and gets data bits off of it and puts data bits on it. It can port the SCSI commands that are coming from the initiator. I want to read cluster 20, and going over to that target disk, it can take those SCSI commands, bundle them up as a transportable payload of bits, frame them into an Ethernet frame using TCP/IP as its transport protocol, and put it right on your TCP/IP network. The beauty of iSCSI SAN, and the reason it has become so popular lately, especially for the SQL Server 2005 or 2008 SQL Server database server in a SharePoint farm, is because when you compare the old Fiber Channel to the new iSCSI, back in the old days with FTIP, even though we take fiber channel SANs, and we could port their content over to other networks, you had to have these gateway devices for the initiator, and they didn't call it an initiator. That's a nice fuzzy term, but you get the idea. For the server who wanted to access the disk, to talk to the disk itself, you had to have these specific pieces of hardware, these HBA cards, to get that network to share its data with another fiber channel network. You had to buy these FTIP gateways. There was a lot of hardware cost in that top drawing of maintaining the old style of SAN. In the new iSCSI style, you don't need any of that stuff. You can lean on your already existing TCP/IP infrastructure, so you don't have to buy a lot of extra hardware. Now, I don't mean to say that SANs are cheap. They're not. When you start comparing buying a server that you sit on the floor that has 2 or maybe 3 SCSI hard drives inside the case, certainly that's going to be a lot less expensive than going out and purchasing a SAN solution. But again, it goes back to which of these are you planning on implementing? Are you going to be doing a small farm, or are you going to be doing a large enterprise farm? In that small farm drawing, that SQL Server database in the back, if this is a relatively small implementation of SharePoint, again, I reiterate, less than 1,500 users, rather static data, probably less than a good, I would say, 800 gigs worth of data. That's about the most you're ever going to have. If this is a small environment, then having that SQL Server SharePoint database server be a local disk server with local platters right in the case is fine. It's fine. RAID those platters up with a RAID controller on the motherboard to give yourself a little fault tolerance like with mirroring or striping. But really, you could leave it as a local box. But then again, if you had to support 5,000 or 10,000, or like the IRS of our federal government here in the U.S., 107,000 users that were going to be using SharePoint. I mean, this is a huge implementation. Even if you went with this logical layout for your farm, and I wouldn't think that they would, but even if they went with single WFD and a single SQL server behind it, they would have to start thinking about clustering that SQL server so that they could get a hold of an iSCSI or a fiber channel SAN behind it, because they're going to need terabytes worth of storage space for their content databases.
Hey, I'm going to say a couple things here, Wendy. First of all, I'm getting some questions here, so that's good. I'm going to go ahead and tally these questions. Whatever I can answer offline, I'll answer for you guys. But if you have any questions that you want to ask, go ahead and do that from the questions and answer panel. That's the best way to ask a question. And then I'll queue it up, like I said, and I'll ask Wendy at the end of this webinar. Second thing, some of you might be wondering if this webinar is being recorded. This one is being recorded right now, and we're going to have it available for free for a few days in our SharePointVideos.com site. So you can see that on SharePointVideos.com site within about a day or two. I'll go ahead and send it out in a newsletter that it's available. And let's see. Once again, one more thing that I had mentioned in the beginning was that if you are looking for content or subscription content for SharePointVideos.com, there's a code that you can use, storage, excuse me, storage webinar, just one word. And that will get you all this content and a whole lot more. $9.95 for the first one, and then after that it's $19.95. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and actually, Wendy, there's one more question that I did have that I wrote down over here that I wanted to ask you as you're going through these things, if you don't mind. So high availability, disaster recovery are big things when it comes to, of course, planning for storage considerations and all. And this is right in line with what you're talking about here. Can my storage choice for SharePoint help me with that?
Yeah, that is high availability is definitely a primary concern of a lot of your SharePoint deployments today. You know, years ago, when SharePoint Portal Server 2003 was out, and people were just starting to really embrace the collaboration technology from Microsoft, they didn't really rely on it too much. They tended to put some of the fun stuff out there, or maybe, you know, a few departments in the company would put important stuff out there. But most of the mission-critical data that they were using was still back on a tried-and-true trusted facility like an Oracle database or a production SQL Server database they've been using. But when MOS 2007 came out with WSS version 3 underneath, all of the new Web 2.0 tools and document management tools really perked everybody's interest. And SharePoint has enjoyed quite the sales ride in the last 4 years. This has become a really predominant popular product for the Microsoft stable. Well, one of the things about SharePoint being popular is companies have started to put more and more mission critical information into SharePoint. Not only that, but a lot of that data may be federally regulated. So like if you're a hospital and you start putting patient records into SharePoint, there's going to be HIPAA laws that dictate the security of that, how many copies of it there has to be, all kinds of regulations that you have to keep up with as well. So SharePoint being a popular platform and all of this mission-critical data being placed into it has really increased people's attention to making that data highly available. What do we do if the SharePoint server goes down? Well, one of the things about scaling your farm the way we just talked about is if you had more than one web front-end server that the users could get to, if one of those web front-end servers went down, it really wouldn't be a big deal in your SharePoint farm because the users would just start using the other remaining WFEs and they'd be able to get to their stuff. But in the drawings I showed you guys a moment ago, you probably noticed when we were talking about the farms that there was always only one SQL Server 2005 database server in the drawing. And that's why I kept harping on a lot of companies will decide to cluster that SQL Server because that's really where all your mission-critical data is sitting. That is what you cannot afford to lose. If your index server goes down, users will be inconvenienced for a little while because when they go to perform searches, they may not get the results they were looking for. If your configuration database inside SQL Server happens to have an issue inside that database itself, it's going to be more inconvenient for the SharePoint administrator because they're not going to be able to build new web apps and new site collections. But the existing site collections that are in the healthy content databases will still serve their content up to the users. But if any of those content databases go away, your users are going to know it. They're going to know it quick. So how do you go about protecting your SharePoint content? Well, one of the things here is if I go ahead and share back out my virtual machine, this is central administration. And in SharePoint, there's really not a whole lot of tools for duplicating a set of data in SharePoint so that you've got a redundant separate set of data. If you sit here and say, okay, I'm going to build a second content database for one of my web apps, and you can do that. You can build more than one content database for a single web app so that it's used multiple databases. But the thing is, they're not duplicate databases. The web app will start stretching its content across those two databases, but if you lost either one of them, the site collections within that web app would go Jenga. We have in MOS, now this is particularly a MOS thing, we have the ability in Microsoft Office SharePoint Server to engage in what's called content delivery. If I head over to Operations in Central Admin, there is a tool in MOS called Content Deployment Utility. And the Content Deployment Utility, his job in life is to allow you to take a set of content from anywhere in your MOS enterprise and deploy that content out to an alternative SharePoint location. This could be used, and I say that very lightly, it could be used to deploy content out. But you'd have to devise an entirely second separate SharePoint enterprise to deploy it to. And your content deployment settings for a MOS server farm only allow you to send out to one location. So let's say you had a SOC or a HIPAA regulation that said when it comes to patient records, there has to be 3 copies. Well, content deployment is going to help you there because you can only deploy the patient records out to one alternative target destination. So there's no way to configure this utility to send 3 copies out to 3 different SharePoint enterprises. It can only send 1 copy out to one target. And if you go out and read on the internet about the content deployment utility in MOS 2007, you're going to read a lot of bad buzz about it. It's rather clunky in the way that it does this deployment. you set up tasks, you set up rules, but you do have to monitor this thing pretty heavily. You have to watch that SharePoint timer service, the one that's responsible for all the automated jobs. You really have to babysit this tool. Trust me when I tell you it gets way better in the next version of SharePoint. But for right now, it's not really a viable, good, robust tool for using to duplicate your data and have a redundant copy. Lucky for us, we have SQL Server under this thing. So if I go into Management Studio, there are things I can do as a DBA right here within the SQL Server product to protect that content database. I could set up database mirroring. I could back up the database and have a copy on tape ready to go in case something happens. I could set up high availability solutions in here like clustering, log shipping. I could take snapshots of the database. But all of this would be right here within SQL Server. And again, in a segregated IT environment, your DBAs may tell you, I'm not doing that for you. Sorry, not going to do it. So what do? Well, those iSCSI sands that we were just looking at a moment ago, these iSCSI sands actually have the ability to use their own control software to duplicate redundant sets of the binary digits stored on the disk. And the beauty of some of these tools, now it depends on who you buy. You'd want to shop for your iSCSI sand really carefully. But a lot of your sand manufacturers, their control software has utilities in it that will duplicate sections of the data and place it elsewhere. You can even configure these things to grow dynamically, actually go out and set up a virtual area bigger than the actual data in anticipation of more data coming in later. Boy, does that sound appropriate for SharePoint, huh? There's all kinds of things that can be in the SCSI software that will go about taking care of redundant copies of the data, big allocation footprints, bringing extra disks online from the SAN vault, taking them offline when the users have been on a delete spree and they've been deleting items in SharePoint like crazy, and now the SharePoint content database doesn't need as much room anymore. So you can ask your actual SAN device to dynamically manage the platters and set up some fault-tolerant redundancy for you.
All right. Well, it seems like the content part of it is done. Thank you very much, Wendy, for this awesome information. You know, I don't know about everybody else, and I think they feel the same way, but I learned a lot in here, and this is really good stuff. So what I'm going to do right now is take some of the questions from our attendees. You know, we have, I think, like, what, 10 or 11 questions that got queued up here. So I'll just start from the top, first come, first serve here. The first person is asking, for each site we create in SharePoint, does a new WSS content database get created?
For each individual site that you create, no. When you create a new site like I did in my demo a moment ago, remember I wanted to show an alternative document library, and I said, oh, I'll just do a create site real quick, and I named it test. Creating that site does not generate a new content database, no. It takes up residency in the content database associated with the SharePoint web application in which your new site collection resides. Each web app has one or more site collections in it. You had to visit one of the sites in one of those site collections in order to be able to click the Site Actions menu and hit Create Subsite. So when you create that new subsite, you're establishing its placement in the site collection hierarchy. You're also establishing where its data will lay down. It will lay down in the content database of that resident web app. Now,
wonderful.
If you have a new site that you think is going to need a new content database, put it in a new site collection in a new web app, and you're good to go.
Exactly. And, you know, I think both of us have seen hundreds of sites within the content database, and that's normal at times as well, depending on your need. Another question that comes up, this is a pretty good one. What is recommended web application to site collection ratio?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that. Can you give me that one again?
Sure. What is the recommended web application to site collection ratio?
The recommended. Oh, boy, is that a can of worms. Actually, I will tell you that Microsoft, as the manufacturer of SharePoint, is very, very careful not to give you guys any recommended numbers as far as a minimum number or the recommended number of site collection or the recommended number of site selections per web app. And the reason is because SharePoint is so flexible that they really cannot, come up with a hard number. It really depends on your environment, and it depends on, how much content you plan on placing in each site and that business. I will tell you, however, that Microsoft performed a benchmark test a few years ago when MOS 2007 came out. Now, I'm going to use MOS, but there's a different benchmark test for those of you who have Windows SharePoint Services only environments. And for those of you in the audience who really don't know which one you have, here's the deal. Windows SharePoint Services is a free suite of services you can download and put on your OS. It gives you some document management, a little bit of basic collaboration. If that's all you need, you're good. But if you decide you need some enterprise class support, like enterprise-wide searching and audience targeting and things of that nature, you might go out and pay money for MOS. When you install MOS on a box that already has WSS on it, you can then link your WSS sites up to the MOS environment. If you install MOS on a box that never had WSS on it, it'll place the same functionality onto the box as WSS plus a whole lot more. Some people will say MOS lays down on top of WSS. It's not entirely accurate, but it's a good analogy. But I'm just going to look at the software boundaries for MOS as if you had installed MOS 2007. Now let me share this out. This is not me. This is a Microsoft article. This is called the Plan for Software Boundaries TechNet document, and they went out and did a benchmark test. I hope you guys are looking at my web browser. They went out and did a benchmark test, and they took a certain set of hardware, and they tell you what kind it is. And they ran a bunch of workloads against it. And they give you all these beautiful graphs of pointed diminishing return and whatnot. And from that environment, they came up with what they call their boundaries or maximums. Now, these are not recommendations. They're not saying run right out and create 150,000 site collections per web app. They're just saying if you go beyond 150,000 site collections per web app on a piece of hardware that similarly matches the hardware in this benchmark test, you're going to start seeing diminishing returns. Now, don't take these as gospel. I have seen a lot of guys out there blogging on the internet, some of whom should know better, that are using these numbers as gospel and saying, do not build more than 150,000 site collections per web app. Microsoft says so. That's not what they're saying at all. They're saying that on this particular hardware, with this particular workload on it, they hit a point of diminishing performance return at this maximum number of site collections per web app. That doesn't mean that the product won't support more. It will. It all depends on your hardware, and it depends on how you're using the product. But this CC262787 document for MOS is a really nice document to live by when you're first getting started, and make sure you don't go beyond these until you have a chance to beef up your hardware.
Wonderful. This next one I think I can answer myself as well. This person is asking, how do you put the URL of a document workspace in a document library so that folks can go to the documents workspace right away when they navigate to the document library itself instead of going to view all sites or view all content? And I think what this person is asking is just having maybe a link which appears as a document in a library, and you click on that link and you go directly to the underlying document workspace. This is a little bit off from the kind of stuff we're talking about in this webinar, but let me go ahead and answer this quickly. That you just make a new content type. Well, actually, there's already an existing content type that you can use in the library. It's called the linked to document, I believe, linked to document content type. Just use that, and it's just going to let you link to anywhere else in your portal, and that's just going to appear just like any other document in the library. Okay, here's another question for you, Wendy. For fault tolerance and speed, is it better to go with SQL mirroring or SAN with SQL cluster?
That's kind of a personal opinion sort of thing. And by SQL mirroring, I assume the person is asking about SQL Server 2005 and 2008 database mirroring technology.
I think so.
And I would have to tell you, in my personal experience, I've been in the industry 19 years. I've been a SQL DBA back since SQL 6.0. I've been working with that product a long time. Over and over and over and over again, I would tell you, if you can afford it, that SAN is the better way to go. And here's why. If you think about it, asking SQL Server app as a product to do the database mirroring for you from a performance standpoint It's a great fault-tolerant thing, don't get me wrong. But the mirrored database, the one that you're mirroring to, the one you're sending the changes to with the redundant copy, is completely offline until it's needed. This is not workload balancing, so it will not help you with performance at all. Database mirroring is a fault-tolerant solution only. That mirror won't kick up until the primary dies, and then the mirror is needed. Even if you employ a third SQL server, even if you do the whole witness thing, it still takes time at the application level, layer 7 of the OSI model, to make all this happen. If instead you would use your SAM device, your storage platform, to be the one to do the rollover for you, it's happening down at the physical layer. It's happening way down here at the bottom 2 layers of the OSI model, the data link layer with all the driver control, the physical layer with the actual hard drive. This is where your flip over is happening, and it's going to happen way faster for you than going all the way up the OSI model to the application layer and wait for an application to do it. So if you have the money, it would be my personal recommendation, go with the SAM.
Okay. Next one. Wait a minute, I'm reading the wrong one here. How do you provision storage for a MySite?
Oh, great question. Moz introduces these MySites that you can let your users have their own websites. And for those of us who are SharePoint admins and data security admins, it makes us skin crawl. But the idea is the user is going to go out there and put whatever the heck they want on whatever the heck they want. The beauty is MySites are really nothing more than a very specific kind of site selection. Now, when you install your SSP, because MySites are in your shared service provider in Moz, you have the opportunity not to bring MySites on when you first install the SSP, and it would be my recommendation that you don't. And then you would go out and create a completely separate second web application just for your MySite. Now, when it comes to controlling the size of your MySite, you have quota templates available to you in that web app, just like you would have quota templates available in any web application. If you go into Central Admin, you go down to the web application general properties, you have the opportunity to add a quota limit to all the sites that ever get created inside that web app. I would strongly recommend implementing quota limits on your MySite to keep that MySite's content database from overrunning your SQL Server storage.
Great, thank you. And now this question, I'm not sure if you've already covered it or not. It says our single content database has grown very large, and what are the steps to split it up? Are there other options for reducing the size?
Okay, here's somebody who has already gone down the garden path. They've been working with SharePoint for quite a while now, and what they found is their users loved it, and now they've got this honking huge content database, probably up in the 600 or 800 gigabytes, maybe even the terabyte size. When it comes to splitting your web application out, one of the things that you can do, and I'm going to share this app again, hopefully. Here we go. Hopefully you guys are looking at my VM, and I know we're running over in just a few minutes. I hope everybody's hanging out. But the person who asked this question, if you're still here I am in Central Admin. I went to Application Management. I clicked on Content Databases link. You can add a content database to your web application. And if you add a second content database, you have the opportunity to say which SQL server in your environment it will be on, and it doesn't have to be the one that you're currently using for your first content database. You could put it on a totally different instance of SQL if you wanted to. You give it a custom name, and now everything that comes into this site, these site selections in this web app from today forward will start being added to this second content database. So SharePoint, you don't have any control over. It's not an all or nothing proposition. But SharePoint will start utilizing this second content database as it sees fit, and you will start seeing your first content database stop at its current size. It won't grow anymore, and this new one will start filling up. So you can add a content database to an existing web app anytime you like. Just to recap, you're in Application Management. You go under SharePoint Web App Management to Content Databases. You pick the web application you wish to extend, and you simply say Add Content Database. Done.
Great. I had another question which is exactly the same. How do you create a site in a new content database? You already showed that. And another one that says, when does performance start to degrade due to content database size?
That's a difficult question to answer because it's really going to depend on your hardware. If you have your SQL Server installed on, let's say, a 1.6 gigahertz, maybe only 8 to 10 gigs of RAM, 64-bit architecture. And by the way, guys, don't buy any servers that aren't 64-bit. Please, please, please. 32-bit is on its way out as far as Microsoft is concerned for server hardware. Take advantage of the 64-bit because it allows you to take advantage of bigger chunks of RAM. And if there is one thing that SQL Server and IIS and SharePoint love, it's memory. So please, guys, if you're going out shopping, invest in 64-bit architecture. Okay, I'm off my soapbox. It really is going to depend on your hardware, because if you're on a 1.6 gigahertz with only 8 gigs of RAM on it and you're using a non-SCSI hard drive architecture and that's your SQL Server, your content database is probably going to start showing performance degradation when it hits roughly about probably 200 gigs. And it's going to get to 200 gig quick. So, you know, I can't really give a finite answer for that. It depends on the hardware that you're running underneath the SQL Server product.
All right, wonderful. And you know, this last one, I'm not sure if this is really a question or just more of a statement, but I'll go ahead and read it out. And if there's any guidance you can provide on that, that'd be good. And this will be the last one here, folks. So this is a long one. It says, we base our number of site collections on the size of the databases. The database size is limited by the time it takes to back up and restore that particular database. So our number of sites is loosely based on our SLA. And we measure the changes in backup restore times to adjust database size per instance. Some databases contain the type of data which allows it to perform well above 50 gigabyte. Otherwise, others we keep close to 25 gigabyte and just add more databases to that application. Okay.
Can I make a comment?
Yeah, absolutely.
I hope this person is still in the room. I really, really hope this person is still in the room.
This person is, yeah.
Good. Okay. You have my sympathies, whoever you are, because I cannot imagine trying to manage multiple databases simply because of an SLA constriction about backup. So I admire you for tackling it that way to honor your service level agreement. That's a rare trait, and you're doing very well to do that. But let me give you a little alternative to maybe think about. That SLA is binding you, holding your feet to the fire, so to speak, because of the downtime window you are allowed to perform backup. There is a new trend in our industry, and it's not unique to SharePoint. Those SAN systems that I was showing you, the iSCSI and the fiber channel, a lot of those companies that are doing that sort of thing now, and I don't know if you're storing your SharePoint databases on a SAN, but if you are, it might be worth talking to your SAN manufacturer about. A lot of folks who have SAN storage now are starting to lean more on the SAN software for being able to recover data rather than backup and restore strategies. I am not advocating ditching all your backup and restore strategies in favor of your disk management utilities. But for you in particular who has this situation, this may be an alternate avenue. You could take your SharePoint servers down and you wouldn't have to perform backups anymore. So let's say you decided, okay, enough with this 25 gig content database here, 50 gig content database there, 30 content database there. We're going to go ahead and design our sites, our site collections, and our web apps the way the data taxonomy says it would best benefit our business users. So that's really what SharePoint's about, is benefiting the business user. So we're going to ignore the SLA and the fact that says I can't have more than an hour to perform a backup. I'm going to go ahead and design my structure in SharePoint according to my data taxonomy and my business needs. If that content database is going to get 600 terabytes big, doesn't matter, because I'm not going to do backups on it anymore. I'm going to allow the disk management software, if I have a problem, to be able to go over and get bits back for me. And here's the just icing on the cake. You can do brick level restore with these disk utilities because they actually create the redundant copy and retrieve the redundant copy should you need to during a restore process at the bit level. So you may even get more granularity in your restore processes from using their tools than from using the backup software you're currently using. I would definitely encourage whoever wrote that question or comment to please take a look at your storage facility. If it does happen to be a SAN product, please talk to your sand manufacturer about how they might be able to help you come up with an alternative to running traditional backup and restore.
All right. Thanks very much, Wendy. I'm going to take the presentation back to me here, Wendy. And I'll show my screen. So once again, folks, this was Wendy that we have talked to so far. Thank you very much, Wendy, for this wonderful presentation. I think this is a lot of good information. If you want to find out more, sorry?
My pleasure.
Oh, great. If you want to find out more about Wendy herself, you can go to SharePoint-videos.com/about, and there's more of a profile about her. There's lots of stuff that she has done in the past. Also, her book that she used in the presentation, she uses some excerpts from that. You can find out about that book by just searching for storage considerations for Microsoft SharePoint or going to this URL that I'm showing right now. And lastly here, let's see. I want to also show, come on slide, show up. Huh. My slide froze over here again. Here we go. If you want to contact us, email us, info@sharepointelearning.com. We do training, we do consulting online and also on site. Let us know, myself, Wendy, we're both available if you have the need. If you want to subscribe to our SharePoint videos, SharePoint-videos.com is the URL, and the coupon code Storage Webinar is going to be valid for the next few days until Wednesday, September 23rd. You can get the first 30 days for $9.95 by using that coupon code. And that's about it. Well, we're going to put this webinar for free for a few days. Then it goes into the subscriber pile. But for a few days, you can watch this webinar if you like on our SharePoint-videos.com. It should be available either later today or hopefully by Monday. That's it. There's going to be a survey that's going to come up right after you exit the webinar. So please take the survey. Would really appreciate us letting us know if there's any feedback that you have. And hopefully we'll come back with more content. And the more feedback you provide us, the more we're motivated to do more content like this for free. Let us know. Thank you very much, folks. It's been great. Thank you, Wendy, once again. It's been really nice chatting with you again. Hope to talk to you all soon. Take care. Bye-bye now.
Bye, everybody.